Okay, it's 9:40, it's when we're meant to start. I think this is probably going to be a quieter session because we've suffered from being up against Rory Bremner, but understandable, I feel. This is going to be a really interesting session. We've got two very different speakers talking to us about overlapping issues. So first, we've got Lindsay talking to us about her work that comes out of her research at the University of Glasgow, where she's looking at how sleep is affected by single gene syndromes and the interaction with intellectual disability. And then we've got Adam talking to us about his experience as a parent of an autistic child, again around similar issues. And that's going to be really interesting because he's one of the people who featured a lot on BBC News during COVID, talking to the nation about how COVID was affecting children and young people who had intellectual difficulties. So without me taking up too much time, I'm going to hand over to Lindsay as our first speaker.
Hello everyone. I don't know if anyone else would be coming in. If nobody's read the programme and would prefer to go and see Rory Bremner, that's fine, I won't be offended. So thank you for having me. I'm Lindsay Mizen. I'm a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. I went to medical school in Glasgow, so no, that's all right. And I'm also a consultant psychiatrist in the Lothian Learning Disabilities Service. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about sleep. So we should probably define that to start with. We all know what it is, but it's kind of difficult to explain that. So looking at the Cambridge Dictionary, it says that it is the resting state in which the body is not active and the mind is unconscious. Why is it important? Well, if you read things, it tells you it's a third of your life. Quite clearly, that varies from person to person, but I think we would all agree it is a significant part of our life. There's still a lot that we don't understand about it, but again, I think we all know without reading any research that it affects daily function. So if you've not had a good night's sleep, you will realize that you're not concentrating as well. You're maybe not remembering things as well as you might like to. Your mood might be affected. You might not feel like you want to interact with other people in quite the same way, and you might lack energy. We also know, though, that over longer periods of time, sleep problems can affect the immune system, the way the body repairs itself, and health more generally. I was asked to give you some prevalence figures of sleep problems in the neurodiverse population. I'm really sorry, this is vague. Sleep problems are high in intellectual disability, ADHD, and for autistic people. But it really depends on how the studies are done, where you recruit the people from. If you recruit them from a sleep clinic, then they're going to have more sleep problems, or certain types of sleep problems are probably more prevalent. Looking at age, a lot of research will split between children and adults. There is some more research coming out now for older adults specifically, which is good because your sleep can change over your lifetime. And study methods, so we talk about objective and subjective measures. Subjective being usually questionnaires, so asking parents or people themselves what their sleep is like. That can be affected by their sort of emotional response to it, or difficulties with just remembering what your sleep was like over time. Objective measures, which I will talk a bit about in a minute, are using equipment to measure sleep so that it's not reliant on the person's own recollection. And then the type of sleep problem as well, there are an awful lot of different ones. So if you look at the prevalence of certain problems, so sleep-related breathing disorders, you can find papers that say 0.5% to 100% prevalence in the groups they're looking at. So this is vague, sorry. However, I am studying a particular condition called SYNGAP1-related intellectual disability. SYNGAP is a protein. It is found at synapses in the brain, and it interacts with the many other proteins that are in the same area. to regulate the transmission of signals from one brain cell to the next. What we know is that the gene that codes for that protein, that's the blueprint for it, is also SYNGAP1. And if there are variants in that gene, it can result in SYNGAP1-related intellectual disability. And you can see a group of children who are affected, and this is from a 2019 paper by Vlatekamp. Obviously, it's associated with intellectual disability, but many of these people are also autistic, a high prevalence of epilepsy in this group, and sleep problems are really difficult for folk as well. At the moment, there's just over 1,000 people who are known to have SYNGAP1 worldwide, although that's very dependent on people having had genetic testing, so it will be an underestimate. So my study was called The Evaluation of Sleep and SYNGAP1, and we wanted to do this because there's not been a lot of detailed systematic study of sleep in SYNGAP1. But also we have colleagues locally who have rat models of SYNGAP1, so rats that have variants in the gene. And they are able to do some of the objective measures that you can also do in people. So things like EEG for brain activity, and measures of circadian rhythm, which is the sleep-wake cycle, the sort of 24-hour cycle of our activity, so being awake and being asleep. So we wanted to see whether we could find measures that showed biomarkers across the two species. Biomarkers being signature patterns of something, so in this case, looking at what you would find in SYNGAP1 and not in people who don't have the condition. We did this in a variety of ways. I'm not going to have time to tell you about all of them, I'm afraid. But what we did was questionnaires. So we had the subjective measures of sleep, mental and physical health, social circumstances, and quality of life. We also did polysomnography. So that is a set of different measures that normally people would be brought into hospital to a sleep laboratory for 24 hours, and various different measures would be taken while they were asleep. It involves lots of different equipment. There's an element of that in the middle picture here. I'll come to that in a second. So it measures things like brain activity, eye movements, muscle movements, breathing, oxygen levels, and video. That is really difficult for children with intellectual disability, people who are autistic, and I'm using the word children partly because that's what we studied, but also because the lack of genetic testing in adults means that the people we know about are mostly children. And we decided that we needed to do this in a different way. So we took the equipment to the children in their own homes. So they were in a familiar environment and sleeping in their own beds. My research assistant, Stevie Williams, has been the mainstay of the recordings. He is a sleep physiologist. And we slimmed down the amount of equipment. So the boys in the middle are both wearing the recording equipment. You can see they're not in bed, they're not attached to anything. They can get up, walk around, do what they normally do. And then on the left, you'll see there's the camera, and the little boy's got the pulse oximeter on his finger, which is why he's glowing red. On the right is an actigraph watch. So actigraphy is where you measure levels of activity during the day, so it's based on how much you're moving. It's a bit like a Fitbit, but ours was a bit more expensive and specific. We asked children to wear that continuously for a week. The sleep recordings were done for 2 consecutive nights within that week. So, we'll start with the questionnaires. As I say, this is really slimmed down in terms of what I can tell you, but also because our data analysis is ongoing. So we aim to recruit 15 people with SYNGAP1 and 15 controls. As you can see, there was a range of ages from 4 to 14 overall, and the ranges of age and the average age were not any different within the SYNGAP and control groups, and neither was gender a factor that was different between the two. Is this where I have to swap to the other one? No? Okay. So the children's sleep habits is a questionnaire with a total of 33 questions. It asks usually parents, although we did have some participants who could do it for themselves, the frequency of various different sleep behaviours during a typical week. And you score it all up, and if you have a score over 41, it's indicative of sleep abnormalities. That's how it's considered. As you can see, so throughout all of these graphs, the children with SYNGAP 1 are in orange, and the controls are in blue. The SYNGAP 1 group had higher scores. So their average was around about 52, and the controls were 42. For those who are paying attention, obviously that means that the controls actually had a high level of sleep problems as well. We don't know the answers to why yet. We haven't been able to crunch all the data yet, but it might be that because there's somebody else in their household, because most of them were siblings of the SYNGAP 1 group, so that the person with SYNGAP 1 with disrupted sleep might be disrupting the sleep of their sibling. So maybe that explains some of it. This doesn't like me anymore. Okay, so there are also different ways that you can split the children's sleep habits up into different types of sleep problems. Some of these will be fairly obvious. So daytime sleepiness, I don't think you need me to explain. Disordered breathing. Parasomnias are things like sleepwalking, night terrors, waking confused, sometimes being very restless, wetting the bed, that kind of thing. Sleep onset delay is when it takes a long time to go to sleep, so usually more than 20 minutes-ish. And bedtime resistance is struggling to encourage the person to go to bed, struggling to go to bed at the same time, needing to be in somebody else's bed, afraid of sleeping alone. And throughout these 8, there were only 3 that were not significantly different in SYNGAP 1, showing us that actually there's quite a spread of different sleep problems in the condition. So moving on to actigraphy, so this was the bit with the watch. So we did have some difficulties in the SYNGAP 1 group. With the questionnaires, we had 15 questionnaires from the SYNGAP 1 group. In the actigraphy, we lost 2 of those. That was because one was so distressed trying to put the watch on that we actually got no recording at all, and also with the sleep recordings at home. The other one did manage the sleep recordings at home because they were already asleep when the equipment was put on, but also didn't tolerate the watch. So you get different parameters from the actigraphy. So we looked at total sleep time and the time in bed when they already had the recording equipment activated, and neither of these were significantly different between the groups. However, when you drill down into this a bit further, the sleep efficiency, so the percentage of total time in bed when you're actually asleep, plus periods of wakefulness after going to sleep, are both higher. They're not both higher, they're both significantly different in the SYNGAP 1 group. So the sleep efficiency is worse in SYNGAP 1, and the wake after sleep onset is higher, so they spend more time overnight awake. This in some ways is similar to some of the questionnaire data, I think you'll maybe agree, particularly perhaps with the parasomnias, so the sleepwalking, the night terrors, being awake overnight, maybe not so much wetting the bed as a lot of the children are using incontinence pads. So we're looking at whether how much the subjective questionnaires correlate with the actigraphy. And as I say, we're in the early phases of that. We also asked parents or participants to keep a sleep diary. So every night of the week that we were recording, and in terms of having the watch on, they were telling us about when they went to bed, how long it took to get to sleep, when they woke up, these kind of things. So why does this happen? What is the mechanism behind sleep problems? It's difficult. There's no one answer to this. But when we think about how things are clinically for people, a lot of people are on medication called melatonin. Some of you may be familiar with it. Melatonin is a regulator of the sleep-wake cycle, and it's dependent on light coming in through your eyes. So as light levels drop in the evening, it causes the release of melatonin through pathways between two different areas of the brain. So initially, the signals go to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Excellent, I said that without slipping over that. Wasn't entirely sure if I was going to manage that. Which then signals to the pineal gland, which is where the melatonin is released from. So in terms of SYNGAP1, we don't know the mechanisms, but also we haven't systematically studied this yet, which is why we're doing what we're doing. But we do know that SYNGAP1 has been found by Aiton et al. In the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so that may be a clue. So rounding up why this is important, the sleep research, not only is it because of the impact on people, and not only is that in terms of the things that we talked about at the beginning with concentration, mood, memory, all of that, we also have some evidence from our study that quality of life is affected in these children. What we don't know yet is how much of that is just to do with sleep and how much of it is due to many of the difficulties and health problems that they have, but it's something we want to look into. Because we have this melatonin system in the brain that we, to some extent, understand, there's researchers who've looked at the sort of typical function of those pathways. We now have the ability to say, okay, well, if SYNGAP is mutated, this will typically be in sort of rat or mouse models probably. How does that affect that system? And there are many other proteins that are sort of linked around brain function that can also feed into this pathway. So maybe that's the direction going forward. And there are people, particularly in Oxford, who are looking at some of those. And some of those chemicals or proteins are known also to be associated with intellectual disability if there are variants in the genes. Why use actigraphy? Why don't you just ask people for questionnaire data? Well, it comes back to that subjective versus objective measure. And particularly, say, for parents who aren't in the same room as their child, they may not be able to answer how long did it take them to go to sleep. They will probably know if their child is up during the night because they will probably be through to see them. But the actigraphy allows us to get that data without being too intrusive. The children generally tolerated it, and it can also be done over a longer period. So some people will record for much longer than a week to get an idea over that longer period of time. The other thing we don't know yet, and we will be looking at, is because 2 of our nights were the sleep recordings in the participants' own homes, that might have disrupted their circadian rhythm during that time. So if I was doing further work, in terms of the feasibility of it, I am hoping to take the actigraphy forward, perhaps do it over a longer period, and we'll see what happens. I'd like to do that in SYNGAP1 more broadly, so that the community in the UK, which is what we based our study on, is reasonably small, although much larger than some other countries where there isn't genetic testing. So that's what I'm hoping to do next, and I'm hoping to make links with different support groups for other conditions, not just SYNGAP1, where this might be applicable. So to finish off, just because there are sleep problems that may relate to mechanisms within the brain does not mean that certain things won't work. So sleep hygiene is probably a term that a lot of people have heard of. Some of these things you will be aware of. They can work. You may have to be reasonably strict with it, but they can work for a lot of people. So things like going to bed and getting up at a regular time, trying your very hardest not to allow napping during the day. Caffeine, I think I'd be surprised if there's anybody in the room who doesn't know that caffeine can keep you awake. But people don't necessarily realize that nicotine and alcohol can affect your sleep. It tends to upset your sleep during the night, so that you don't feel so refreshed in the morning. Bed is for sleeping. Avoid eating, TV, mobile phone in bed. Wind down before you go to bed, calming music, a bath, that kind of thing. Make sure your bedroom environment is dark, quiet, comfortable, cool. And if you do wake up or can't get to sleep, go and do something boring. Don't lie in bed waiting. So with my last few seconds, my acknowledgements, we really couldn't do any of this work without the participants and families. We have close links with the SYNGAP1 support groups in the UK and in the US, and they're just so important to us. We have family working days, family conference days rather, usually once a year or so. This photo is deliberately greyed out. I would really like it to be bright, but unfortunately it's very pixelated at this size, so it doesn't look quite as bad now that it's greyed out, but it's a shame. So there's researchers and families in there. I work as part of a working group as well with parents with SYNGAP1. We meet 4 times a year to discuss priorities from the community and what we're doing. And sponsors are there. I work as part of the CARID group, Clinically Applied Research in Intellectual Disabilities, and we're funded by the Simons Initiative for the Developing Brain and the Patrick Wild Centre.
Thank you very much.
Hiya. So my name's Adam. I'm starting to wander already, and I said I wouldn't. So my name's Adam. My son is Ryan. There's us up there, first photo. So I'm Adam. My son Ryan is autistic and he has learning disabilities. He's also, later on, he was told that he had a severe mental impairment as well. So I guess we've got to go right to the beginning to where it started. So at 3 years old, he was diagnosed autistic with learning disabilities. Around 6 months later, my relationship with his mum broke down and we were homeless. Just me and him, little guy, one night, 3 years old, his tiny little hand in my great big hand. I was much bigger back then. Steel worker, rugby player, bricklayer. I gave all that up to look after my son. So that night, at 3 years old, we set out. And in just 3 weeks, I got us a house, got us a home. And at 14, I slept in phone boxes, supermarket car parks. I was homeless myself. And I wasn't going to let that happen to him. So I did everything I could. I've got OCD, anxiety, waiting to be diagnosed autistic myself. Now, we talk about OCD, we talk about all the bad things that it brings, and it does bring bad things, but it gives you drive. God damn it, it gives you drive. It gives you drive, it gives you ambition, and it gives you this relentlessness. And in 3 weeks, I was able to get us a home. So that first night in the bungalow, I always look back at fond memories. We had this massive bungalow in the outskirts of Gloucestershire, huge bungalow, fields everywhere, and no furniture except Ryan's bed. I slept on the floor next to his bed because he's what we call a flight risk. You've got to hold his hand all the time. He's going to try the doors. He's better escape artist than any Houdini. You put him in a room and he will find a way out of it. I mean, you know. And so I'm slept on the floor next to his bed, and I'm falling asleep. I'm still a young dad. I'm still making mistakes. I've got a lot to learn. I've still got a lot to learn. But he's always going to teach me. And that night, he gets up. I'm fast asleep. He goes into the fridge, one thing we do have in the fridge is Lunchables. Back then, I think you still get them now, little packs of ham and cheese. We had loads of them in the fridge because that's the food he could eat. Autistic, only eat one food. And so I get up, it's all gone quiet, go in the room, and he's taken all these ham and cheese slices out and he's put them all over the telly. Back then he was wearing nappies, took his nappy off, contents of his nappy, all over the room. You're going to learn hard. You're going to learn fast and hard as a parent. When you're a single parent, when you've got someone that's got an intellectual disability, but at the same time, he has got more intelligence than I will ever have. The brightest person in any room. The person that will figure out things in a second. So that's where it started, you know, and I guess that's where I can't go back to. I can't go back to how hard it was in those days. I learned from those days and learned how difficult it was in those days. And I learned how important routine was. I learned how important the routine for sleep is for Ryan. The lady was talking about, with autism, routine is everything. We don't say 8 o'clock bedtime and meet and go up and do 5 past or 5 to. We say 8 o'clock and we mean 8 o'clock because you're tapping into the OCD, you're tapping into the autism. 8 o'clock on the dot. Because 8 o'clock on the dot might mean they've just watched their favourite programme. That's why it's 8 o'clock. The favourite thing on the radio might have just finished. The theme tune. That's why it's 8 o'clock. That's why it can't be 5 to. That's why it can't be 5 past, because then we go into a different routine. It's got to be 8 o'clock. You're going to start a routine. You start that routine. And when we say routine, we don't mean Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, because that's 1 week. When we say month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, we do this thing at Christmas where people say, every Christmas we do this routine, and parents say, well, we do it every year. My child's 8. Okay, so you've done it 8 times. That's nothing. You've got to do it. You look in terms of routines for weeks of the year, you've got 52. 52, and you've got to get those routines spot on. And once you get those routines, the behaviour changes, the risk of running away changes, the flight risk that we talked about, all that changes. And that, my son stood there with me right there. It's because of routine. It's because of the way we have a sleep routine, we have a breakfast routine, we have a dinner routine, a Monday routine, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, a Saturday routine, Sunday routine. So one of you guys asked me what I'm doing on Saturday. On Saturday, I'm going to Bristol. And my son already knows I'm going to Bristol. He knows we're going to Bristol. He knows we're going to Bristol in the car. He knows what we're having to dinner when we get to Bristol. He knows what time we'll be leaving Bristol. He knows what we're doing next Saturday. Last Saturday, we went to the cinema. He knew that in advance. All those things are important. Those things are more important than you can imagine, because those things, they form the safety net for my son. They form the importance. They help him feel safe. They help him feel secure. So when I say 8 o'clock, don't be go. So another thing I do is back in the bungalow, he didn't wear clothes. Any clothes whatsoever. Now, this isn't unusual with autistic people. We don't like it. It's just, we don't like the feel of it on our skin. We don't like it. So he didn't wear clothes. So what I used to do is every day before we went to sleep, I'd put the clothes out, same time, same place. I don't ask a kid to do something. They're not going to do it. This is even more so with someone that's autistic. They're not going to do it. Same clothes, same place, same time, every single day. So now what's happening is he's walking past the clothes from his bedroom to the toilet every day, and he sees the clothes. He's doing that week on, week out, week on, week out. One day he picks the clothes up and he puts the clothes on. Last year, And this is what I talk about routine and how long it takes. Last year, for the first time in 20 years of doing that routine, he went and got the clothes out of the cupboard himself, and he now takes the clothes out of the cupboard himself and puts them in that place and then puts the clothes on. That's the importance of routine. And so that's what I mean when parents say, well, you know, we tried it on the Monday and we tried it on the Tuesday and we tried it on the Wednesday. Nah, because if you tried it on the Monday, that's 1. Because the following Monday, that's 2. Because each day is different. Each day, because the TV programs are different, the things on the radio are different, the school days are different, the days off are different. You've got to have consistency. Think in terms of week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and on and on and on. So, routines, as you can tell, are pretty important. So a typical day for me and Ryan start at between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. A good day starts around 5. So if Ryan gets up at 5 o'clock and goes to bed at 10, get around 7 hours sleep, which is fine because it could be 2 o'clock, right? So I'm fine with it being 5. During COVID, I was going to sleep about 11, getting up about 12, getting about an hour's sleep a night. And then during COVID, I was still trying to do all the routines that were taken away. I was still trying to do those, even if they were the tiniest threads of a routine. I was still doing them just to try and give him something that he could rely on in his safety net. And when you give him those tiny things, because lockdown went on so long, you start building new routines. Now, these new routines, they're not ideal because he wants the old routines, but they help a little. Not a lot, but they help a tiny bit because you're still building on that tiny routine that you've got. And routines are important. And when he gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I say he goes to bed at 10, I get up at 5, but when he goes to bed at 10, I've probably already been doing research, paperwork, and all those sort of things. So when I say research and paperwork, what do I mean? Well, what do I mean about that is that, so I've had to fight for everything for Ryan. I've had to fight for education, post-education, social care, transport to get to education, blue badge, PIP, housing. There ain't anything that I haven't had to fight for. What happens is, you very often I help other parents that go through this now. They get told that their child's autistic and they need an EHCP, but they can't get an EHCP. The very person that's told them they need an EHCP will be the person they have to fight to get that EHCP. And once they get that EHCP, they then have to fight for the education authority to provide the support for that EHCP. And that's just the start of it. My son's 26 and I still have to fight for everything all the time. There isn't anything that I haven't had to fight for. And it's exhausting and it wears you out. You've got to be the loudest person in any room. Because when I go in a room, that's who I'm fighting for. Him. And my son isn't non-verbal, but he has an intellectual disability, he's autistic, and he's got severe mental impairment. If I don't fight for him, if parents don't fight for their children, who will? Who's going to fight for him when I'm gone? Who's going to fight for him when I'm not there? Who's going to kiss him goodnight? Who's going to insist on those routines? Who's going to look after our vulnerable people? Because, we've got a situation where we shouldn't have to fight, and we shouldn't have to fight for... when Ryan was diagnosed autistic, I didn't even get a leaflet. Nowadays, I think some parents are offered parenting courses, depending on where they live in the county, but not all. You don't get ongoing support, you don't get ongoing help. And what if you're diagnosed as an adult? Nothing. There is no help, no support. What you've got to do is you've got to be the person that I fought this lady once for 3 months on social services, and they'd tripled Ryan's fees. social care fees. You have to pay for fees for them to attend, for my son to attend day centre. So they tripled the fees. And I weren't having any of that. So I fought this lady for 3 months, long and hard. And I won. I took on the Gloucestershire Social Services and Director of Social Services, and I won. And a couple of months, and I had to hound this lady. I had to do all my own research. I had to do all my own paperwork, as well as caring for my son and my other 2 children. I had to do all that. And months later, I phoned this lady on an unrelated matter, and I gave her a call. And she picked up the phone and said, "Oh, can I speak to such and such?" And she said, "Oh, just a minute, Mr. Murphy." And I said, "How did you know it's me?" She said, "I remembered your voice." And that's what you've got to do. You've got to be the person that gives them nightmares when they go home. You've got to be that loud. You've got to be funny. You've got to know everything that you've got to know more than their job than they do. And that takes the research when the person you're caring for is asleep. When they're asleep, when you're knackered, when you're worn out, you want to go to sleep, you want to go to bed, but you can't. You've got to research. That's the time that you've got to get on your game. That's the time that you've got to get everything. Another thing I do, so say a social worker or teacher in a district, say Gloucestershire, I'm from Gloucestershire, say she turns around and says, "You can't have this." So what I'll do is I'll go to all the other districts throughout the UK, and I'll find someone in the same job as her that has agreed to what I've just asked for. I'll use that as an example to fight the woman that's just said no. I'll write it all up, get her to write up all the reasons she said no, and I've won housing over that, not just for me, but for other people. Because what happens is you get a situation where as soon as you say autistic, as soon as you say learning disabilities, that door closes. That phone goes down. People don't want to know. People aren't interested. Because once they start helping you, then there's other people that they need to help. Once they start helping you, then there's funding for other people. And I got to a point where a few years ago, I was the 1 person out of 10 that was winning the fights. So there's 10 people in the room. You go in a room and you're the person that's winning the fights. There's 9 people that aren't. There's 9 people that aren't getting that support. And the reason that we talk about it, the reason I do interviews and do my social media is because now we need to reach those other 9 people so that they all get the help and support, so they know how to fill out the forms, so that they know how to bang on the doors. And you know, so that they don't feel alone when they're doing all those fighting, because it really is exhausting. But we can't just talk about the fighting. We can't just talk about what it, you know, we've got, I mean, he's an amazing young man. He can tell you every Christmas #1 that ever was. He can tell you the album it was from. He can tell you if the person passed away, so say it was a 1960s album, it'll tell you the year they passed away. It'll tell you the movies it was in, and it'll tell you all the covers that have been. So if it's so Spirit in the Sky is one of his favourite songs, but we all know it was an 80s thing, but it was actually by someone in the 60s called Norman Greenbaum. Ryan taught me that. That was in, you know, and he has this encyclopedia of knowledge. He can take me anywhere in the UK from memory. So I'm in Scotland now, I come from Gloucestershire. He could bring me here by memory, but he loves maps and music. Those are his 2 things. So those are what makes him happy. He loves when he was 3 years old, he used to follow the lines with his finger on the big AA maps, remember the great big ones? And then nowadays he uses Google Maps and things like that. And I think I've got another slide. And so we talk about food. You remember how I talked about Lunchables? That was his only food. This is what Ryan eats now. And similar with the clothes. Do you remember how I said about the clothes on the landing? Food the same. Don't ask a child to eat different food. Why would you? The answer will always be no. Put the food on the table. put the food on the table, don't ask to eat it, just make it visible, make it there, make it available, and then if he wants to eat it, he'll eat it in his own time. Go to food markets. You know, you're looking at that food and go, we can't all afford to buy food like that. You're right. Go to food markets. Go to places where you get all the free food. Go round all the different tables and all so they can try all the different food, so that they can try the textures, the smells, do all those things. And that's where, you know, on Saturday we went to John Lewis, and similar thing with that. We've started going around all the aftershave stores and getting little sample cards so that he gets used to all the different smells and all. And it's just different things like that. You pick up another thing. Ryan has eczema on his arms, on his hands, really bad eczema. He won't, you can't see it in there on those photos because he no longer has eczema. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So yeah, so he's got eczema, so he won't have cream on his hands. So I don't put cream on his hands. I've got the eczema cream, so what I do instead of that, I put it on the towel. The towel that I use to dry him, I use to wipe his hands. He doesn't kick up a fuss because he's got the cream on. Instead, the cream goes on the towel, and then I dry him off with a towel, and then it just goes on his hands, and now he hasn't got eczema. And it's just little things like that you pick up over the years, and it's just, you know, and we're back to the food. He will now eat salad, burger. A big thing with Ryan particularly, and I've noticed a lot of other autistic people, they don't like food when it's hidden. So donuts with a jam inside, or a sandwich. Do an open sandwich. Ryan helps me cook, helps me buy ingredients. That way he can see what's on the plate in front of him. He cooked what's on the plate in front of him. He knows where it came, the supermarket that it came from, because he went with me. He went on the bus or the train, and he shopped for the ingredients. Those are important things as well, because then we're not just bringing out food from the kitchen and we're plonking it on side and going, eat that. No, that won't work. That won't work. I wouldn't pull up with that. Can you imagine going to a restaurant and sat there and someone turns out and chucks me a plate of food and I'm like, I didn't order that rubbish. Do you know what I mean? It won't work. So go to the super... Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one. So it started with me and Ryan holding hands back when we were at the bungalow, and that's where it's finished. We're still 26 years on. We still hold hands everywhere, every single day. So I'm sorry, it's a bit. I get very passionate and I've gone a bit over. But.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. If you and Lindsay would come and sit up here, and then we haven't had any questions on the app, but if there's any questions in the room, Miriam's happy to come round and bring you a microphone to ask them. Is there anything anybody would like to ask? Yeah. Well.
Is there, thank you, by the way. Is there something like a support network for people with debilitating insomnia? I could spend 20 minutes asking that question, but I'll just wrap that one up at that point.
It's not my area of expertise, just because I specifically work with people with SYNGAP 1. Are you talking about people from the autistic community or intellectual disability? Or?
It's generally thought to be comorbid with ADHD and similar things, and I suspect it is with me. So that kind of community, yes.
So there are different communities available, out there to support different people with different conditions. Sorry, that's really vague. But there certainly are intellectual disability support groups, for example, and resources out there. Some of the more generic advice has also worked for some of my patients. So our nurses work with children. Some of the Sleep Scotland advice, for example, is more specific to children as far as I understand it. But yes, so there is information out there.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
Hey, thanks. Thank you both of you. They're really good talks. I had two questions for Lindsay. SYNGAP is really rare, but I was wondering if there's any trends in particular demographics where it's common, like certain ethnicities or populations, and also if anyone has looked into the impact of melatonin on children with SYNGAP, the effects.
So the first part of that question is very dependent on genetic testing being available. I'm not aware of any sort of ethnicity profiles within SYNGAP1, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. I've already forgotten the second part. Oh, melatonin. No, it hasn't been systematically looked at. There are various big databases of people with SYNGAP1 where they have uploaded their medical records or they've answered questions and that's gone into a database, but nobody's systematically gone and found a cohort of people and then either given them melatonin or not to see what happens. Some of the people in our study did have melatonin. It was only a small number, I think 3 of the SYNGAP1 children were taking melatonin. Unfortunately, because our numbers are small, we would have liked to see what the effect of that was, but because the total number is only 15 and for the actigraphy 13, we can't subdivide into that yet, but that's another reason why I would like to do a bigger study to see if we can tease that out a bit.
We've had a question through the app for Adam. They've said, you seem to have a really good understanding of your son. You've mentioned possibly being autistic yourself. Do you think that this helps your understanding of him?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, I'm diagnosed with OCD and anxiety. That's commonly what happens before an autism diagnosis. So yeah, undoubtedly.
Fair enough. Were there any more questions from the room?
I just want to thank you, Adam, for a great speech. And
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind.
We're touching to you about your son.
Thank you.
And I'm glad to. I think you're OCD a bit, so not sleeping in phone boxes anymore or cars.
Oh, you think I'm what? Sorry, I didn't.
I think that you have become as well as you want to be, considering your OCD.
Yeah, I mean,
surprising man today.
I've got severe anxiety, and people when I talk, people say you wouldn't know it, but I was saying to the lady before, and I mean, I was at a stage where I was wrapped up in my duvet and my knees are shaking and I couldn't move, but Ryan's calling me in the other room and I have to move. I have to get up. And he saves me every single day without even knowing it, you know?
That's really powerful. Thank you. Were there any other questions or comments? Yes, over here.
Hello. This is a question for Adam. You mentioned very briefly about having to fight for Adam in terms of education. I was just interested to hear a bit more about that story, about the kind of ups and downs, what you had to do.
Yeah, so what happens after education is you then get offered further education. So I'm from Cheltenham. You've probably all heard of the Star College or National Star College. That's in Ellenwood, which is just outside Cheltenham, where Harvey Price goes. And so I was very lucky that Ryan went there, but I had to fight for his place. So Ryan was promised a place in a specialist autistic school, never got built. So instead, he was given a place within a special unit within National Star College. Technically, he never went to Star College, but the council had to give him a place because it was something I fought for. So, and when we talk about education, when we talk about social care, when we talk about any of those things, it's not just that. You've then got to look back. It's the transport to education. Post-education, after a child is 18, they've got to pay for their transport. All that comes out of the money and all. The day centre that my son goes to, he was offered, we were told he would only get 2 days. 2 days. This is someone with profound learning disabilities, with severe mental impairment, only get 2. So I said to the lady, I'll fight for 7. She laughed. And I said, well, what? She said, you'll never get 7. That's impossible. I said, that's okay, because I only want 5. I got 5 days.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've hit 10:30. It is now time for coffee. I just want to say thank you again to both of our speakers. That was really interesting and a really, for me, really insightful link between some of the hard research that's happening and then the impact we see it having in people's lives. So thank you both, and do enjoy the break.